When you go to mix, does this look familiar?
Okay, mixing fast. Let's put a little bit of reverberation on these congas. All right, turn that up. Oh yeah, it's nice and subtle. Okay. Oh, there's a little bit of mud. Let's get rid of that mud. Maybe it's between 100 and 200 hertz. Okay, find that. Yes, okay. Oh, that's much better. Very clear now. And let's find, okay, some whistle tone on these strings. Where is that? Let's just crank this up. Move this around a little bit here. Listening. And oh, that's very annoying. Let's just get rid of that. Oh, yes, now we're getting somewhere very nice.
Somebody needs After Hours. Welcome to After Hours. My name is Gregory Scott. Let's talk about small moves. Let's talk about what that means. It's very tempting. And in fact, in many ways, it's necessary, especially early in the game, when your ears aren't as sensitive to tiny little adjustments. Like, I'm at the point now where if I have an EQ on my mix bus, 0.2 of a dB, I immediately know that's what's going on. I hear that. That's not for everybody right now. It's probably not for you. So one of the things is when you're not at that level of sensitivity yet, you have to push things too far just to hear what it's doing. Here's the way you kind of work with that in the beginning is do it. Go too far. What sounds right to you, you're like, okay, let me turn this EQ up. A lot of people like to turn EQs up 12 dB and then sweep around to find a frequency. If I could convince you to max 6 dB on that thing and then sweep around with 6 dB, you'll be doing yourself a huge favor because these are the ways that you learn to sensitize your ear to smaller and smaller changes. So when you're sweeping for frequencies, and eventually we'd like to get you not sweeping for frequencies, but for now, if that's what you need to do, 6 dB. Because another thing that happens is if you crank it by 12 dB and then you spend 10 seconds, but 30 seconds sweeping around, finding that right frequency, your brain has adapted to that torqued sound. And then when you go to back it off and find the right spot, you've lost sense of what the actual natural baseline is. And then maybe you're only backing it off to 6 dB, whereas if you had boosted to 6 dB in the first place and swept around, you'd comfortably back it off to 3 or even 2 dB and be like, I can hear that change. It's meaningful. So max 6 dB when you're sweeping around, if you can. But whatever you do, wherever you land, if it's an EQ and you do a certain move, you boost something by 4 dB and you're like, that's right, cut it in half, 2 dB, and then leave it there. Resist. Even if part of you's like, I know that's not enough 8K on that voice. That's okay. You'll come back around to it. But as you adjust other things, you might actually find that, in fact, that's enough 8K. You might find 8K is the wrong frequency. It needs to be down to 6K. So lots of interesting things happen when you make smaller moves and you do it faster. You keep your perspective for a lot longer. And because your moves are more conservative, you leave more space for other possibilities in terms of the textures and layers in the production. And here's what I mean by that. One of the most nefarious things about compression is that like attracts like with compression. The brain likes dynamic range to all feel similar. And what I mean by that is if you start off at the beginning of a mix and you take a sound like a bass or a drum bus or a vocal and you pin it, like you take the dynamic range and you're like, that sounds so exciting and good now. The problem is that your brain is going to want mostly everything or everything else in the mix to be crushed down into that same limited dynamic range. Otherwise, it's not going to fit. It's not going to feel right. It's not going to sound right. You can have these really dynamic drums and this really urgent crushed vocal just sitting there not moving. You're like, that's not right. And then the instinct and the tendency is to crush everything to match those initial levels of compression. So the beautiful thing about cutting your moves in half is you leave more space for less processing to get the job done. Because another thing about perspective is if you spend the first half hour of your mix with your drums really crushed, that's going to sound right to you from that point forward. And you've kind of painted yourself into a corner. You have fewer options. There's always going to be time and space to crush things more and more and more. But The cool thing about doing these things in layers and moving through fast and doing smaller moves is that you find different spaces and shapes and forms and approaches to things because you were more conservative. You didn't block off all of your options from the get-go. You didn't just paint yellow across the whole wall and be like, well, I guess this is all kind of, my canvas is yellow now. You just put a little bit of a ochre up there and just got that. And then you're over here, oh, look, it's just. So when you get the compression sounding like, okay, that sounds right, especially when it's really early in a mix, but also when you're working fastly and trying to do smaller moves, back the compression off, usually by using the threshold and just raising the threshold up until it sounds not quite compressed enough. Make that your best bet. That's not quite enough of the 2K that I want on the horns. Oh, that's not quite enough compression on that kick drum. Do that. Move on. Because a lot of the reason why that doesn't sound like enough compression is because other things need to be molded to fit. And once you start shaving everything else, taking a little bit off there, adding a little bit of 2K there, taking 3 dB off of this sound here with that compressor, adding a little bit. Distortion is another one. It's like when you're dialing up the distortion, when you get it set, back that off until you're like, that's just a little bit cleaner than I wanted it. Leave it there. Move on. Sending something into an effect. Be like, okay, there's the vocal into the reverb. That's the level I like it. What's the send at? The send's at -12. Back it off to -15. Just go where you think it needs to be, and then just relax it just a little bit, and then move on. So mix fast. Make smaller moves. Keep moving through sounds. Don't spend too much time on any one thing, and report back.